Okay, let's unpack this. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a young man in, say, 7th century China, bent over his desk, scrolls everywhere,
Mm.
the oil lamps flickering, casting these long shadows, and outside, the city, Chan'an. It's quiet, his eyes are tired, his hand probably aches from writing, but inside, there's this fire,
Yeah.
this fierce ambition for a future that's totally different from the one he was born into. He's dreaming of becoming an official, stepping onto a path that could just completely transform his life, his family's life.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah, and this isn't just any student. This is a hopeful scholar trying to navigate the incredibly complex, demanding world of the Tang Dynasty Imperial examinations.
And that image, it really captures the stakes involved, doesn't it? This wasn't just about, passing a test. It was like unlocking a whole different reality, a chance to climb the social ladder through sheer brain power in a way that was, well, pretty much unheard of elsewhere in the world back then.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what this deep dive is all about today. We're going to explore this Tang Dynasty Imperial examination system. The engine, really, that drove the dreams of so many ambitious people and fundamentally reshaped Chinese society.
Right.
Think of this as your guide to understanding the burning desire, the complex pathways, the sort of hidden rules, and even the echoes of it that feel surprisingly modern. It's an incredible historical institution.
Yeah. Well, look at what pushed these scholars to study so intensely, how they had to kind of figure out the different exams and the rules, the really crucial role of reputation and, networking outside the actual exam hall.
Well, it's a big one.
Huge. And ultimately, the massive impact this whole system had, not just in China, but eventually much, much later around the world.
So our mission today is to pull out the most compelling insights from this fascinating system to help you understand what really mattered if you wanted to, make it in Tang China. So where do we even start? What was the core thing, the fundamental drive that made people dedicate years, sometimes decades, to this?
Well, it really boiled down to one central goal: becoming an official. The term was zuguan.
Zubai.
Yeah. And in the Tang Dynasty, this wasn't just about getting a job. It was a complete elevation of your status.
Yeah.
You were moving into an elite class with immense power, prestige, and, importantly, privileges.
Okay.
There's an old proverb that really sums up this ambition. Sui shi zhi shi.
Who's they use is she?
Right.
Yeah.
Basically, he who excels in study can follow an official career. And this wasn't just some nice saying. It was the explicit, widely accepted path to success and influence for any educated man back then.
And the process after passing the exams, it had this incredibly powerful, almost symbolic moment, right? There's this final qualification exam from the Ministry of Personnel, the...
Libu.
Yes.
The Libu.
And that final step was called Chie, which literally translates to shedding the coarse cloth.
Shedding the coarse cloth. Wow, that phrase just gives you chills, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the transformation.
It really does. You're literally shedding the simple, maybe rough hemp clothing of a commoner, or maybe just a less distinguished scholar, and putting on the formal robes, maybe silk, of an official. You weren't just changing jobs, you were publicly, officially leaving your old life, your old status behind, and joining the ruling class, the mandarins.
And this system, it became the dominant pathway. As the imperial examination system got more established in the Tang, more and more ambitious men took this route. It created the sense that, well, if you had talent, the only real way to use it, to serve the emperor or society, was through these exams.
Right.
You even see this feeling echoed by some of the greatest thinkers of the time. Han Yu, a huge literary figure in the mid-Tang, he actually lamented about talented people whose abilities were just useless, basically stifled because they couldn't pass the exams.
So even back then, there was a sense that the system, while offering opportunity, could also be a bottleneck.
Exactly. He felt it could kind of stifle genius if that genius didn't fit the specific mold of the exams.
And it's fascinating how long that idea lasted. It wasn't just a Tang thing. Fast forward centuries to the Qing Dynasty, and the novelist Wu Jingzi, in his book, The Scholars, has a character, Ma saying almost the exact same thing as Han Yu.
Yeah.
He says that even someone as incredibly wise as Confucius himself, if he were around then, would still have to hit the books, study the required texts, write the standardized essays, and pass the formal exams to get a government job.
Wow. That really hammers it home.
It shows just how completely this exam system became the undisputed gateway to power and status for centuries.
But the drive wasn't just about, abstract ideas of serving the state or even just prestige. There were incredibly tangible, life-altering benefits that hit close to home, impacting not just the scholar, but his whole family.
Okay, like what? What were these concrete benefits?
Well, probably the biggest one was escaping corvée labor. That's fuyoyu.
Fuyoyi, right, forced labor.
Exactly. In ancient China, this was a massive burden on ordinary people. Forced physical labor for the state. Think building huge projects like parts of the Great Wall, repairing canals, building palaces.
Stuff that could be incredibly dangerous, too. We all know that tragic folktale of Lady Mingjiang, whose husband died doing that kind of brutal labor.
Gets you sleep.
Yeah.
For your average farmer, corvée was this constant, draining obligation, sometimes deadly.
So how did the exams help?
Well, simply getting an imperial examination degree meant exemption from corvée labor.
Just passing.
Just passing. Imagine the relief, the economic freedom, maybe even the life saved by avoiding that. This was a huge immediate incentive for so many families.
Even led to some pretty weird consequences at the lower levels, didn't it? There was that exam for kids.
Ah, yes, the child scholar examination, Tangzik. It was meant for kids under 10. Really simple stuff, mostly memorizing and dictating basic texts. The original idea was good, encourage early learning. But the unintended consequence was massive, because passing that exam, even as a little kid, also granted the degree and, therefore, the corvée exemption.
Oh, wow.
So suddenly you had parents desperate to shield their families from this labor, sending these incredibly young children to take this basic test just to get the exemption.
That sounds kind of exploitative.
It became a real issue. It was seen as distorting the whole point of the system, so much so that a minister later, in the Five Dynasties period, actually proposed getting rid of it altogether.
Okay, so even the lowest degree offered this escape. What about the higher levels?
The stakes got even higher with the most prestigious degree, the Jinshi.
The Jinshi, that's the big one.
That's the big one. While those lower degrees might just exempt the scholar himself, passing the Jinshi exam could exempt his entire family from corvée labor.
A whole family. Seriously.
The entire family. So the scholar's ambition suddenly became this quest for the security and well-being of his parents, his siblings, maybe even extended relatives.
That puts a whole different spin on the pressure, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and that's exactly why getting a Jinshi in the family wasn't just about individual success. It was a monumental achievement. It brought honor and status to the entire lineage. Pretty much every wealthy household, even those not from the old aristocracy, desperately wanted to produce a Jinshi. It was the ultimate proof that they'd made it through hard work and intellect.
And the personal weight of that family expectation.
Mm.
It could be incredibly moving. There's that story about the poet Kuishu right before he took his exam. His father was really sick.
Mm-hmm.
And before Kuishu left, his father, apparently too weak to talk much, just shakily wrote the Chinese character for person twice on a piece of paper.
Just the character for person, twice.
That simple act, those two characters, it symbolized everything. His father was basically pouring all his hopes into that gesture hope that his son would pass, fulfill his potential, become a true talent, a complete person in the highest sense society recognized. It just shows how deeply intertwined the personal ambition was with the fate and the hopes of the whole family. The exam wasn't just a solo effort. It carried the weight of generations.
And this whole system even influenced dynamics within the family unit. Maintaining harmonious family relationships. Kiji was a fundamental expectation.
Kiji, right, harmonizing the family.
Yeah. And wives often were expected to encourage, sometimes even push their husbands to study hard and pass those exams, to become dragons, as the saying went.
So your spouse was often part of that pressure system too.
Very much so. That expectation from one's wife was a common theme in domestic life, and it continued for centuries after the Tang.
It makes you look at certain characters in literature differently, like Lin Dayu in Dream of the Red Chamber.
How so?
Well, one of the main reasons the hero Jia Baoyu felt such a deep, unique bond with her was precisely because she didn't pressure him to chase an official career or study for the exams.
Ah, right.
In a society where that expectation was pretty much the default, her lack of demand for him to follow that path felt like this profound kind of intellectual and emotional acceptance. It was unusual.
That's a great point. So when you tally up the motivations, they were layered and incredibly strong. You've got the ultimate prize, becoming an official.
Right.
You've got escaping the brutal reality of corvée labor, maybe for your whole family.
Huge.
And you've got elevating your family's honor and stability in society.
When you put all those together, the chance to join the elite, dodge forced labor, secure your family's status. Can you imagine the intensity, the pressure, but also the sheer depth of motivation?
It really makes those late-night study sessions feel less like academic pursuit and more like this desperate, hopeful fight for survival and dignity, doesn't it?
Totally. It's a completely different kind of motivational fuel than, say, getting good grades today.
It really is. So, okay, once that burning ambition was lit, the next big hurdle was actually navigating the system itself. Because the Tang exams weren't just one monolithic test. You had to choose your path.
Right. It wasn't one size fits all. The Tang had multiple subjects, and candidates had to be strategic, picking an exam based on their strengths, maybe even their connections.
Exactly. There were specialized subjects for specific skills. For instance, MingQing, clear law, that was for legal experts. Then there was MingSuan, clear calculations for people good with numbers.
And that really unique one, the Taoist examination, dog, testing knowledge of texts like Laozi and Zhuangzi. Why on earth did they have that?
That one's a fascinating bit of political maneuvering. The Tang emperors, their family name was Li,
Okay.
and they claimed descent from Laozi, the founder of Taoism, whose personal name was also Li Lever.
Oh, convenient.
Very. This probably fabricated lineage was meant to boost the imperial family's prestige and legitimacy. So suddenly showing you knew your Taoist philosophy could be a path into government. It was basically a political requirement dressed up as an academic one.
Wow, imperial propaganda shaping the exam syllabus. But you said these specialized exams, like the Taoist one, they were kind of niche, right?
Yeah, generally niche. They didn't attract the bulk of the top talent, and they didn't really last beyond the Tang Dynasty. The two main highways, the big gates to power and status, were the Jinshi and MingQing exams.
Jinshi and MingQing? Okay.
These were the primary routes to becoming an official.
And the Jinshi was definitely the more prestigious one.
Yeah.
The harder one.
Oh, absolutely. Unequivocally. Passing the Jinshi was seen as a monumental achievement, the real gold standard.
You can really see the attitude in that anecdote from the Tang Yulin collection. The poet Yuan Zhen, who'd passed the MingQing exam, went to visit Li He, a celebrated poet who was a Jinshi passer.
Right, and he basically slammed the door in his face.
Worse than that, his servant, probably echoing Li He's own feelings, basically insulted Yuan Zhen, saying something like, "MingQing, what's that? You, a mere MingQing passer, practically a backdoor entrant, you dare visit Master Li."
Ouch. Calling a MingQing passer a backdoor entrant, that tells you everything about the perceived difference in difficulty and talent. Apparently that sparked a lifelong feud between them.
It really shows the immense pride, maybe even arrogance that came with having that Jinshi degree.
And the reason for that pride was simple. It was just significantly harder to pass. Scarcity made it precious.
There's that saying, right, about the ages.
Yes, the famous one. 30 is old for MingQing, 50 is young for Jinshi.
So if you passed MingQing at 30, people thought you were a bit slow. But passing the Jinshi at 50, you were still considered, what, a promising young talent.
Exactly. It shows just how incredibly difficult the Jinshi was perceived to be compared to the MingQing. Passing it at 50 was still a remarkable feat.
And the numbers back this up.
They do. Records from Emperor Wuzong's time show the total number of successful Jinshi and MingQing candidates together rarely topped 100 in a year, and most of those were MingQing.
Only 100 total for the whole empire.
In many years, yes. And even during Emperor Xuanzong's prosperous Kaiyuan era, when they were trying to bring in more talent, the annual number of Jinshi passers was usually only around 30.
30? Out of how many trying?
Out of thousands, maybe even over 10,000 candidates each year. So the pass rate for Jinshi was incredibly low, maybe 3% to 5% in a good year.
That's brutal. No wonder so many Tang poems are about disappointment and exam failure.
Absolutely. It's why so much of the poetry from that era is tinged with this melancholy. One of the most famous examples, though it's debated, is Zhangji's incredible poem, A Night Mooring by Maple Bridge.
Ah, yes. Moon sinks, crows cry, frost fills the sky. Those lines just perfectly capture that feeling of lonely despair.
And one compelling theory is that Zhangji wrote that poem right after failing the Jinshi exam. He was on a boat near Hanshan Temple, maybe reflecting on his failure, and the sounds and sights just coalesced into that masterpiece.
It's a poignant thought, isn't it? That the sheer difficulty and crushing disappointment of this system might have inadvertently fueled some of China's greatest poetry.
It's very possible. So let's dig into what actually made that Jinshi exam so tough. It was a 3-stage gauntlet, is that right?
Yes, the structure got finalized later in the Tang, under Emperor Gaozong. He had to pass all 3 rounds, one after the other, to get the degree.
Okay, stage 1.
Stage 1 was poetry. and rhyme prose, shifu. And this was often seen as the most important part.
Poetry, right. And not just any poetry. They had incredibly specific rules about the form. They wanted regulated verse, lushi.
Wuxi. What did that involve?
It meant writing a poem with exactly 5 characters per line, arranged into 6 rhyming couplets, for a total of exactly 12 lines.
5 characters, 6 couplets, 12 lines.
Ooh, yeah.
Woyan Luyun Xierju. That sounds less like writing poetry and more like solving a linguistic Rubik's Cube under pressure.
Kind of. Every character had to fit precise tonal patterns, and there was a strict rhyme scheme running through those 12 lines. It tested technical skill just as much as artistic flair.
Wow. And the rhyme prose part.
That was a longer, more elaborate form, kind of a mix of poetry and prose, often used to describe historical events or landscapes with lots of fancy language. Think of the Han Dynasty masters Sima Shangru.
Oh, it goes. What's interesting, though, is that the actual topics for this round weren't fixed, right? They could be almost anything.
Yeah, the chief examiner set the topic, and it could be historical, scenic. There's an example of a topic being poem on the newly planted small pine tree north of the examination hall.
That feels surprisingly specific, almost whimsical compared to the kind of broad philosophical essay topics you might expect, or that came later.
It does show a certain flexibility in what you wrote about, even if how the format was incredibly strict. Okay, so that's round 1. Round 2 was classic completion, tiajing.
Tijing. This sounds like pure memorization.
It pretty much was.
Yeah.
Imagine getting a passage from a classic text, but with a couple of characters missing from a sentence.
Like fill in the blanks.
Exactly. Fill in the blanks for Confucian classics. The examiners would take a sentence from something like the Book of Rites, the Zuozhuan, or Shangshu, remove 3 characters, and you had to write in the correct missing ones.
So you needed absolute perfect recall of the foundational texts of Chinese government and culture.
Total fidelity to the text was key. Okay, and the third and final stage.
Policy questions, Yushibus.
Right. This was where they tested your understanding of current events, social problems, and your ability to analyze those problems and propose workable solutions, all written up as formal essays.
What kind of real-world issues were they tackling?
We have examples from Emperor Suzong's reign. Candidates were asked things like, how do we fairly manage the officials and the bureaucracy? Or, what's the best way to identify and select talented people for government service?
Practical problems of governance.
Exactly. Li Ku, who later became a chancellor, passed his Jinshi in a year with those kinds of questions. Being able to articulate solid policy arguments was critical. And speaking of policy, it makes you think of figures like Shang Wanyu, and especially his incredibly talented granddaughter, Shang Wanwaner, who served Empress Wu and was famous for her skill in drafting imperial edicts and policy papers.
So the Jinshi required this trifecta. High-level literary artistry and poetry, flawless memorization of classical texts, and sharp analytical skills for policy problems. And you had to nail all 3.
All 3, in sequence. No passing allowed if you failed even one stage.
Okay, so that's the Jinshi beast. What about the MingQing exam? The one that was supposedly easier, the 30 years old for MingQing one.
Right, the one sometimes looked down on by the Jinshi crowd. It also had 3 rounds. There was classic completion, similar to the Jinshis, but maybe covering slightly different texts or being less intensive. There was an oral examination, where you'd recite and explain passages from the classics.
An oral exam. Interesting.
Yeah, and they also had policy questions, like the Jinshi. But the MingQing tested a broader range of core classics, including things like the classic of filial piety and the Analects of Confuciacy, which weren't explicitly tested in the Jinshi's Tiojing round.
So maybe more focus on reciting and knowing the core ethical and foundational texts.
It seems that way. The key difference in perceived difficulty, though, often came down to those policy questions. While both exams had them, historical analysis suggests the level of analysis, the depth expected in the Jinshi policy essays, was significantly higher.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, it highlights why the Jinshi was seen as demanding a more sophisticated, perhaps more original understanding.
So if you were that young scholar we imagined earlier, standing at this crossroads in Tang, China, you had a really critical strategic choice to make.
Absolutely.
Are you the literary whiz kid, ready to bet everything on mastering those complex poetic forms and writing brilliant essays for the high-prestige, high-risk Jinshi? Or are your strengths more in diligent memorization, solid understanding, and maybe reliable recitation, making the MingQing seem like a more achievable, perhaps safer path to still becoming an official?
It was a huge decision. And importantly, both paths could lead to success. You mentioned Di Renji earlier, the famous judge-detective figure.
Yeah.
He started his career through the MingQing exam. It wasn't just about chasing the highest prestige. It was about finding the route that actually fit your skills and your goals.
It's a great question to ask yourself, isn't it? If you were there with your particular talents and ambitions, which gate would you have aimed for, Jinshi or MingQing? And what would sway that decision?
A choice that literally held the key to your future. But, and this is crucial, just being brilliant or picking the right exam wasn't the whole story in Tang China. There was this other layer, an absolutely vital part of the game, marketing yourself.
Yes. This is where the Tang system starts to feel both surprisingly modern and completely alien at the same time. Recommendations, Tujian, they played a huge role, didn't they? And much more openly than in later dynasties.
Much more openly. You see these incredible examples like the story of Qian, who was the vice minister of rights and often oversaw the exams. When the writer Wu Wuling came to him to recommend the talented poet Du Mu.
The one who wrote Ode on Yipang Palace.
That's the one. Wu Wuling basically demanded Du Mu get a spot, and Qian was remarkably frank about it. He apparently said something like, look, the top spots are kind of informally decided already among us examiners, but I can promise you a place.
He admitted they pre-decided spots.
Seemingly so in this account. And when Wu Wuling pushed hard for 5th place specifically, even threatening to pull Du Mu out of the exam entirely if he didn't get it, Qian agreed. And then supposedly Qian openly discussed this whole arrangement with other officials.
He just announced it. Hey everyone, just letting you know, 5th place is sorted for Du Mu. That's mind-boggling from a modern perspective of blind grading and fairness.
It really is, but there was just a much higher tolerance back then for this kind of open recommendation and patronage. It probably came from the lingering influence of the old aristocratic clan system, the Kyusu, Minfazidu, which the exam system was slowly replacing.
Right, before the exams, it was all about who your family was.
Exactly. So while the exams aimed for merit, the old habits of recommendation being normal practice didn't just vanish. It was seen as recommending talent is a matter of course. And this attitude made things like submitting personal writings, hangguan, and seeking patronage, ganye, seem like public, acceptable, almost honorable affairs.
So it wasn't necessarily viewed as cheating or using a back door in the same negative way we might think of it today.
Not quite with the same stigma. It was kind of baked into the process. If you wanted to take the main exams in the capital, Chen, you usually got there one of two ways. Either you were recommended by teachers at the Imperial Academy that was mostly for kids from official families, or you worked your way up as a self-taught scholar through local exams, county, prefecture, province.
Okay.
But either way, you ended up aiming for Tianjin. And once you got there, step 3 was absolutely crucial. Submit your work and build your network.
Because the exams, especially the Jinshi, with its focus on literary talent, were partly subjective.
Very much so. Your reputation, endorsements from big names, influential figures that could seriously impact your results.
So what was the first thing you did in Tianjin?
One of the very first things a serious candidate would do was put together a collection of their best poems and essays and submit it to the Ministry of Rights, the ministry running the exams. This wasn't officially part of the test, but it got your name and your work in front of the examiners beforehand.
And that whole practice, submitting your writings, the hangguan, its main goal was just boosting your reputation, getting on the radar.
Exactly. And the classic story here, almost legendary, is the young Bai Juyi meeting the famous established poet Gu Kuang. Bai Juyi, just starting out, shows up with this 10-volume collection of his poems and essays.
And Gu Kuang's first reaction is priceless, right? He sees the name Bai Juyi, which means living at ease, and he makes that crack. Rice is expensive in Chang'an. Living at ease is not easy here.
Yeah, a bit dismissive, a tough crowd. But then Gu Kuang actually starts reading Bai Juyi's work, and he comes across those incredible lines from the poem Grass. Lush, lush, the grass on the plains. You know the ones. Wildfires cannot burn it all away. The spring breeze blows, and it grows again.
Such powerful, resilient imagery, even now.
Gu Kuang was apparently just blown away. His whole attitude shifted. He reportedly exclaimed, "If someone can write verses like these, then living long in Chang will indeed be easy." And from that point on, Gu Kuang became Bai Juyi's champion, vigorously recommending him in all the important circles.
And Bai Juyi's fame just exploded, didn't it? He passed the Jinshi super young, at 29, which was almost unheard of given that 50 is young for Jinshi, saying his hangguan strategy clearly worked wonders.
It was a necessary, calculated move in that environment. Getting your work seen, getting nods from established figures, that was just part of how you played the game if you wanted the examiners to recognize your talent.
And that story about Wu Wuling pushing Du Mu onto Yan, the vice minister, really shows how open this could be at the very top. Wu Wuling shows up with Du Mu's brilliant ode on Upon Palace and basically says, this guy's a genius, you have to pick him.
And Qian, even though he apparently had other candidates in mind, admired the essay but hesitated. Wu Wulin didn't give up, insisted on 5th place, and threatened to pull Du Mu out if he didn't get it.
That takes some serious nerve.
It does, but Qian, valuing his promise, agreed. And then, as we said, he openly tells other officials, yeah, someone just recommended Du Mu for 5th place. Even when others brought up concerns about Du Mu's, perhaps overly lively lifestyle.
His 10 years a dream in Yangzhou reputation.
Right, which apparently wasn't just gossip. Qian stood firm.
That famous line, I have already promised him, even if Mu is a butcher or a wine cellar, this 5th place will not be changed.
Exactly. And Du Mu got 5th place that year. Now, to us, this whole exchange, the open talk of prearranged spots, it sounds like blatant favoritism, right?
Totally. Cronyism.
But from the Tang perspective, remember, they were transitioning away from an era where recommendations were everything. So recommending someone you genuinely believed had talent wasn't seen as shady. It was viewed as a normal, public, even necessary part of the process. Not something you had to hide like a modern backdoor deal.
So it was almost like a moral obligation. I found this brilliant person. I have to promote them. What if they just have a bad day in the exam hall and their genius gets missed? That's on me.
That seems to have been part of the mindset for some. And this intense pressure to get recommended, to build your reputation, it fostered this whole submitting personal writings culture, the Allah Hangwan Wenhua. Now, if you came from an aristocratic family, you probably had connections already.
Right.
But if you were from a more average background, you had to get really creative to get noticed.
And this is where we get some absolutely wild stories, like Chen Xiang, the poet who wrote Song on Yuzo Terrace. Wealthy family, but low status. Couldn't get noticed in Cheng'an for years.
So he comes up with this incredibly dramatic plan. He goes to the East Market where someone's selling a huqin, a stringed instrument, for this insane price, 1,000,000 kin.
1,000,000. That's like buying a mansion today.
Astronomical. Naturally, a huge crowd gathers, and Chen Xiang steps up and grandly declares, I'll buy it. Everyone's stunned. He then announces he's a master musician and invites everyone to his house the next day for a concert.
Okay, he's got their attention.
Over 100 bigwigs show up expecting music. Instead, after a banquet, Chen Xiang holds up the 1,000,000 kin huqin and says something like, I, Chen Xiang, write excellent essays and poems, but nobody knows them. Music is a minor skill for humble folk. Why should I waste my talent on it?
Ooh, the dramatic climax.
He smashes the incredibly expensive instrument to pieces and tells his servants to hand out copies of his writings to the shocked guests.
No way.
Yes. Within a day, everyone in Cheng'an is talking about this crazy stunt, but also about his writing, which turned out to be genuinely brilliant. He passed the Jinshi soon after, pure performance art for publicity.
That's incredible. And Han Yu, the literary giant, he even used theatrics to help his students, like with Niu Sengru.
Yeah, Han Yu liked Niu Sengru's essay, so he gives him this weird instruction. On such and such a day, go hang out at Qinglong Temple and come back late.
Cryptic.
Niu Sengru trusts him and does it. Meanwhile, Han Yu makes a big public show of going to visit Niu Sengru's place that day, knowing full well he won't be home.
Playing the part.
Perfectly. Han Yu acts all disappointed and writes this lament on Niu Sengru's wall. Visited Niu Sengru, but did not meet him. Deeply regret missing him this time. Signed, Han Yu.
Instant fame by association.
Exactly. Suddenly, Niu Sengru's name is buzzing around the capital, endorsed by the great Han Yu. It was totally staged just to create buzz.
And then there's the most famous story connected to this culture. Jia Dao and his agonizing over push versus knock.
Finfu Tukaya.
Right. Riding his donkey so lost in thought about whether a monk should push or knock on a moonlit door in his poem that he doesn't look where he's going and bumps right into the carriage of Han Yu again.
Of course, Han Yu. Instead of being mad, Han Yu is curious. Jia Dao explains his poetic problem, and Han Yu ponders it and famously advises that knock is the better word.
Now, the debate is whether that was a genuine chance encounter or...
Or maybe Jia Dao deliberately engineered the collision to get Han Yu's attention. Or maybe they even cooked it up together. We don't know for sure.
But all these stories, Du Mu, Chen Xiang, Nu Sengru, Jidao, they highlight something really important about this Hanwan culture,
They
don't they?
do. Getting noticed, getting recommended, it was vital. But these strategies only worked because the underlying talent was real. The marketing opened the door, but the quality of their writing still had to impress. You couldn't just fake it.
And this unique submitting personal writings culture is apparently one of the key reasons why that literary form, Tangquanqi,
Uh-huh.
those complex literary short stories became so popular and developed so much then.
Absolutely. Tan Chuangyu was like the perfect vehicle for Hong Kong.
Why? What made it so perfect for this purpose?
Well, several reasons. First, remember the Jinshi exam's most important part was poetry. Chuangyi authors would naturally weave their own poems into the stories, embedding verses within the narrative.
Right, using poetry to enhance the story.
Yeah, and this even became a tradition later in classical Chinese novels. You often see sections explicitly marked proof through poetry. And think about it, putting your best poems inside a compelling story can make them even more powerful, right?
Definitely. Like Lin Daiyu's Burial of Flowers song. It hits harder because we know her story in Dream of the Red Chamber.
So, showcasing your poetry within a narrative added artistic depth.
Precisely. Second, remember the policy questions. The exams required candidates to show they could analyze issues and argue effectively. Chwonki provided a way to do that too. Authors could weave discussions about social problems or history right into the plot or dialogue.
Sometimes they'd add commentary sections at the end, kind of like Sima Qian's famous brand historian says after his biographies. Or they'd express their views through the speeches their characters made. You find these quite long, concluding arguments in many famous Chuanqi tales.
So in one piece of writing your Hangguan submission, you could show off both your poetic skill and your potential for policy analysis.
Exactly. It was incredibly efficient. Works like Du Mu's Ode on Ipang Palace, which he used as Hangwan, or Ni Sengru's collection of strange tales, Shuangguailu, they were explicitly seen as stepping stones for getting ahead. Through Chuanqi, authors could achieve two goals at once: seeking official positions through writing, and maybe also the higher goal of conveying the way through writing, Niren Dao.
Using literature for personal advancement and to express moral or political ideas.
Right. And there's a third benefit. While pure storytelling wasn't directly tested in the exams, the narrative skills you honed, writing Chuanqi, creating characters, arranging plots, pacing, were incredibly useful after you passed, especially if you got assigned to the prestigious job of helping compile official histories.
Because writing historical biographies requires similar skills to writing fiction.
Very similar. Character portrayal, plotting, even with real events, making it engaging those skills transferred directly.
So this Hangguan system, this whole culture of pre-exam marketing driven by subjective literary exams and the hangover from the recommendation era, it didn't just create funny anecdotes, it actually shaped the literature of the time. Tang Chuanqi was the perfect form to package and showcase exactly the blend of talents the system demanded.
That's a great way to put it.
It's remarkable, that blurring of lines between writing literature, political ambition, and personal branding. When you think about it today, how different really is that impulse to network, build a reputation, maybe showcase your skills through side projects or online portfolios before you even apply for a job or go through a formal evaluation?
The methods are certainly different. Probably less smashing of expensive instruments these days.
Hopefully.
But that underlying drive to get noticed, to make sure the decision makers know who you are before the formal process begins, that feels incredibly familiar, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The Tang system just seemed to embrace it and integrate it more openly into the path to power. Okay, so you've chosen your exam path, you've navigated the complex social dance of Hangguan, you've maybe smashed an instrument or two.
Metaphorically speaking, perhaps.
Metaphorically, you've built your network. Now comes the moment of truth, the exam hall itself. Step 4, surviving the pressure and the incredibly strict rules inside.
Yes. Once you were actually inside that examination compound, the Sha, Gongyuan, while the content of your answers might have had some creative leeway, the format and presentation were governed by brutally rigid rules. Break one, and you were out, no matter how brilliant you were. This was especially true for the Jinshi exam.
Okay, what kind of rules could just instantly torpedo your chances?
Two big ones stand out.
Yeah.
Taboo avoidance, buhui, and strict adherence to stylistic conventions, hupiu.
Taboo avoidance. Bihi, that sounds dangerous.
It was deceptively simple, but absolutely critical. You could never, under any circumstances, use any Chinese character that was part of the current emperor's personal given name, anywhere in your writing, even if it was a common character used in everyday language.
Wait, seriously, so if the emperor's name included a character like, I don't know, dragon, you couldn't use the character dragon in your entire exam paper, even if you were writing about, say, dragons.
Exactly. The poet Li He, who knew the system inside out, specifically warned people about this trap, and the consequences were immediate and severe. If an examiner saw you write the taboo character during the exam, you were instantly kicked out of the hall.
Just like that.
Just like that. And if they missed it then but found it later during grading, your entire paper was invalidated. Exam failed. Automatic disqualification.
That adds an insane layer of high-stakes memory checking and self-censorship to the already immense pressure. Okay, what about the stylistic conventions? Tangxi?
This was particularly tight for the Jinshi policy questions than Yizhe. You had to write your argumentative essays on current affairs using specific literary styles, mainly treatise, lun, or discussion, ye. But it wasn't just about the genre. Your writing also had to possess a certain body and appearance. Body and appearance for an essay? What on earth does that mean? It basically meant the tone and language had to be elegant and dignified. Dingnik Zhuangzong. It required a very formal, elevated, scholarly style appropriate for addressing serious matters of state.
Okay, so like writing for a very serious academic journal today? Maybe? You couldn't just write a story or a poem if they asked for a policy analysis.
Exactly. You couldn't submit a narrative or a poem or just some casual thoughts. It had to be a structured, well-argued essay in the correct, formal, dignified style. One mistake in taboo avoidance or failing to meet the stylistic requirements for that specific essay type could instantly nullify years of hard study.
Wow. The technical rules were just as unforgiving as the intellectual demands.
Absolutely. Now, to try and inject some measure of fairness into this whole process, especially given all that Hangwan influence beforehand, the Tang did implement a system called locking the compound. Sumyon?
Locking everyone in.
Yes. Once the chief examiners and the other officials involved in grading entered the examination compound, the Gongwon, they were literally locked inside, completely cut off from the outside world for the entire grading period.
Total isolation. Why?
The main goal was pretty clear: to prevent any last-minute lobbying, interference, or backdoor shenanigans from reaching the examiners while they were actually reading and scoring the papers. It was an attempt to create a controlled, hopefully impartial environment for that final judgment.
A bit like sequestering a jury today, or keeping exam graders isolated.
Very similar principle. Trying to ensure that the final marks were based only on the work submitted inside the hall, shielded from all that outside pressure and networking that happened before.
It really highlights the tension in the system, doesn't it? On one hand, you have this very public, influence-driven Hangwan culture. On the other, this attempt at complete isolation and anonymity during the crucial grading phase.
It's a fascinating contradiction, and it brings us back one more time to why Tang Xuanqi was such a smart, effective tool for candidates within this specific system.
Because it navigated these demands so well.
Exactly. It let candidates show off the whole package. You could embed your best poetry right in the story, hitting that key Jinshi requirement.
Right.
You could weave in policy arguments or display analytical thinking in the narrative or conclusions, showing you had the chops for the policy questions.
Okay.
And as we discussed, the narrative skills themselves were directly useful for prestigious post-exam work like historical compilation, especially writing those compelling biographies.
So, Chuanqi wasn't just literature for its own sake. It was a strategic power move, a way to demonstrate the full range of talents demanded by the Tang exam system and the bureaucratic career that hopefully followed.
Precisely. It served the practical goal of getting noticed, improving your skills, while also pushing the boundaries of literary form in ways that would last for centuries.
Okay, so the brutal exams are finally over. The papers are handed in. Step 5, that agonizing wait for the results and then figuring out what comes next.
Oh, that waiting period must have been pure torture. The results usually came out in the first month of the following lunar year.
You can just picture the scenes, right? Someone running through the streets with the lists, the explosion of joy for the winners, the crushing silence for those who didn't make it. For those lucky few who passed the Jinshi, though, there was a whole series of rituals and celebrations.
Oh yeah, passing the Jinshi was a major social event. First, you had to go express your gratitude, Chan, formally thanking the chief examiners who picked you.
Showing respect.
Then came the big parties, elaborate celebratory banquets, the most famous being the Kojing banquet, held in a beautiful garden park. It was a chance for all the new Jinshi scholars to celebrate together and basically be toasted by the literary and official elite of the capital.
And the most iconic tradition of all, writing your name on the Wild Goose Pagoda. Yant Timing.
Yes, that's the one everyone remembers. The new Jinshi passers would actually climb the Big Wild Goose Pagoda, a famous landmark still standing today, and literally inscribe their names, sometimes adding short poems, right onto the walls inside.
Like leaving your mark, literally. I was here, I made it.
Exactly. A very public, very permanent declaration of success. And then, of course, the real work began, entering the official bureaucracy and starting their careers.
But what about the vast majority who didn't pass? Given those tiny pass rates, failure had to be way more common than success.
Absolutely. Failure was the norm. The official line was always, don't give up. The exams were held every year, so you could always try again. And many, many did year after year. Some scholars literally spent their entire adult lives chasing that Jinshi dream, failing repeatedly.
So if the main door was closed, what other options did they have? You couldn't just keep studying forever if you needed to eat.
True. Failed candidates had several routes. A common one was to become a private secretary or advisor, a pus muliao, for a high-ranking official or general. Yeah. This provided a living, allowed them to use their education, and crucially, kept them connected to the world of power. It could be a way to build connections for another attempt at the exams, or sometimes it became a career path in itself.
Like the great poet Du Fu, right? He famously failed the exams multiple times.
He did. And later in life, he served as a private secretary, a muliao, for a military governor. It's a really stark reminder that even colossal poetic genius didn't automatically translate into exam success. And sadly, despite his talent, his life ended in poverty and illness.
A tragic story. What other paths were there besides being a secretary?
While some, maybe disillusioned with the whole usual rat race, or perhaps genuinely preferring a quieter life, might choose to live in seclusion. They'd retreat from the capital, focus on their studies, write poetry, maybe teach a few students, but without actively seeking a government post.
The hermit scholar archetype.
Kind of. And then, of course, many just went back home or stayed in Shenyang and hit the books again, hoping that next year would finally be their year.
Looking back at this whole elaborate system, it's so clear it was way more than just a method for picking government workers. It created this incredibly deep, lasting connection between literature and politics in Tang China.
It absolutely did. Success in the Jinshi exam, especially with its heavy emphasis on literary skill, often opened doors to prestigious tasks beyond just day-to-day administration. Many top Jinshi graduates were recruited for things like helping compile the official dynastic histories, which was a hugely respected job.
And those narrative skills from writing Chuanqi came in handy there.
Immensely handy. Those techniques, creating vivid character sketches, structuring events logically, bringing historical figures to life on the page, were directly applicable and highly valued for writing good historical biographies.
And you see this fusion in the big literary figures of the era, don't you? People like Han Yu and Lu Zontuan, leaders of the whole classical prose movement. They weren't just poets or essayists living in ivory towers. They were active officials who had navigated the exam system themselves.
Exactly. They were masters at writing the formal policy essays needed for the exams, and they wrote brilliant Chuanqi stories that combined the kind of rigor and insight you'd want in historical writing with the dynamism and artistry of literature.
Their own works, like Lu Zongyun's Tale of Lu Yi or Han Yu's biography of Guo Tuo, the Hunchback Planter, they really show that synthesis, don't they?
They absolutely do. The Tang exams essentially took that older idea of seeking official positions through writing and kind of elevated it, or at least aimed to elevate it, into a system for governing the nation with literature. It shaped individual lives, for sure, but it also shaped the entire cultural mindset of the dynasty, creating an era where literary talent was seen as fundamentally essential for good government.
It was such a sophisticated system, and it clearly had a massive impact on China's history. But it also brings up a really big comparative question, doesn't it? Why did this kind of systematic, supposedly merit-based talent selection, even with all its complexities and networking, develop so early and become so central in Tang China when you had nothing really comparable in the West at the same time? We're talking, what, roughly the 5th to 10th centuries in Europe?
That's a fantastic question and a crucial point of contrast. The answer really lies in some very deep, fundamental differences between China and medieval Europe back then.
Okay, difference number one, social structure. Medieval Europe was just dominated by feudal aristocracy, right?
Hmm.
Power, land, jobs. It was all about who you were born to, your family was, your ties to a lord.
Pretty much. You look at places like the Frankish kingdom's positions, like counts, dukes, they were basically monopolies held by a few powerful noble families. Even many important church positions, like bishops, often went to the sons of aristocrats.
So for an ordinary person, not born into that elite circle, the idea of rising to power through taking an exam was just unthinkable.
Virtually non-existent. The whole social structure was built on inherited status and lord-vassal bonds. There just wasn't a channel for that kind of meritocratic or theoretically meritocratic advancement through public exams.
Now contrast that sharply with Tang China. We've talked about the influence of old families, but the exam system itself was, at least in theory and increasingly in practice, designed to challenge that monopoly.
Exactly. It offered the possibility for men from less powerful backgrounds, maybe even commoners, though that was probably rare in practice to rise based on their intellect. That famous saying again, be a farmer in the morning, ascend to the emperor's court in the evening.
Even if it was more aspirational than reality for most.
Right. Even if it was aspirational, it represented a pathway, a hope for social mobility based on learning that just didn't exist in the same way in medieval Europe's rigid hierarchy. Tang China was developing this new bureaucratic elite selected by exams, existing alongside and gradually replacing the old hereditary aristocracy.
And other places at the time, the Byzantium, the Islamic world, India.
Well, the Byzantine Empire had a bureaucracy, sure, but officials were chosen more through imperial appointment and recommendation, not really a standardized exam system. The early Islamic caliphates valued culture and learning immensely, but again, official selection wasn't based on formalized exams. It depended more on religion, family ties, tribal loyalty, personal favor. And India, of course, had the very rigid caste system, which severely limited who could even participate in politics based purely on birth.
Okay, so social structure is key. What's reason number two?
Political system. Tang China was a huge, centralized, unified empire.
And you need a big bureaucracy to run a big empire.
Precisely. The emperors needed a way to select educated men from all over the empire who would be loyal to the central government, not just to their local region or family. The exam system was a brilliant tool for this. It helped break the power of entrenched regional aristocrats and strengthen the emperor's control over the administration.
So the exams helped unify the empire by drawing talented people into a centrally controlled bureaucracy.
Yes, selecting these professional bureaucrats who, in theory, obeyed imperial authority because they owed their position to passing the central exams was a fundamental mechanism for holding a vast, unified state together.
Now, medieval Europe. Politically, it was the opposite, right? Feudal fragmentation.
Exactly. Think about Europe after the collapse of Charlemagne's empire. Power with scattered kings, powerful local dukes and counts, the independent church. Central authority was often quite weak.
So kings didn't need a huge civilian bureaucracy selected by exams.
Not in the same way. They relied more on the military support of their aristocratic vassals. They didn't have the same political need, nor, frankly, the administrative capacity to run a nationwide exam system to staff a large central government. The political reality was decentralized power, alliances, and military obligation, not the kind of centralized administration the Tang system was built to serve.
Makes sense. Okay, reason three. Cultural differences.
Huge cultural differences. China had this incredibly deep-rooted tradition linking learning with public service.
The whole scholar official ideal.
Right. The concept of the scholar official, the idea of governing the country with culture. These ideas went way back, centuries before the Tang, to the time of Confucius. And even the earlier, less systematic ways of choosing officials, like the Han recommendation system or the nine-rank system in the dynasties before the Tang, they had already established the principle that selecting officials should involve some kind of assessment of talent and virtue, even if those systems became corrupted.
So the Tang exams built on a long tradition.
They formalized it. They made the study and mastery of Confucian classics the explicit, state-sponsored path to power. This created this powerful feedback loop between culture and politics. You study the classics, you take the exams based on the classics, you get a position where you apply, in theory, the principles from the classics. It reinforced the value of Confucian learning as the bedrock of good governance.
And in medieval Europe, where was knowledge concentrated?
Largely within the church. Education was primarily focused on theology, on training priests and monks, not necessarily on creating secular administrators versed in classical statecraft. While some nobles were certainly educated, there wasn't widespread education for commoners, and certainly no established pathway from mastering specific secular texts directly into political power via exams like in China.
So the core intellectual tradition wasn't geared towards producing state bureaucrats in the same way.
Not in the same direct, institutionalized way. And while other cultures, like the great Islamic civilizations, highly valued knowledge and scholarship, especially in science and philosophy, that learning wasn't formalized into the system for selecting government officials like the Tang exams were for Confucianism.
Okay, so social structure, political system, cultural tradition. What else? Reason 4.
Technical and administrative conditions. This one might seem mundane, but it's crucial. Printing.
Printing.
Yes. The Tang Dynasty saw the increasing popularization of woodblock printing.
Ah, right. That was a huge development.
It was a game changer for the exam system. Woodblock printing allowed for the relatively cheap mass production of books, and crucially, that included the Confucian classics that formed the basis of the exams.
So more people could actually get their hands on the required study materials.
Exactly. It meant that access to the core texts wasn't completely restricted to the very wealthy or those with access to hand-copied manuscripts. It opened up the potential for more people, even from humbler backgrounds, to actually study for the exams.
Whereas in
Europe was still relying on laborious hand-copying of manuscripts, usually onto expensive parchment. Books were rare, incredibly costly. Knowledge was concentrated in monasteries and the wealthiest households. It was just technically much, much harder for ordinary people to access the kind of systematic education needed to even contemplate competing in a nationwide academic exam.
that makes a huge difference.
It really does. And beyond printing, just think about the administration required to run the exam system itself. You needed a unified written language across a vast empire. You needed standardized textbooks and curriculum. You needed a reliable way to administer tests simultaneously in different places, collect the papers, grade thousands of them reasonably consistently, keep records.
A massive bureaucratic undertaking.
Huge. Tang China, with its relatively strong central government and centuries of bureaucratic experience, had developed that administrative capacity. Medieval Europe, with its political fragmentation and less developed central administration, generally lacked the infrastructure to pull off something on that scale.
So it wasn't just one thing, was it? It was this unique combination of factors in China. The social pressures, the needs of a centralized state, the specific cultural value placed on Confucian learning for governance, and even the technology of printing and a mature bureaucracy.
Exactly. Which leads to the fifth point. The imperial examination system was really a unique product of Chinese history. It wasn't some universal stage of development that every civilization was bound to reach. The Sui and Tang dynasties, coming after a long period of division, needed new institutions to consolidate their power and unify the empire. The exam system was a brilliant innovation for their specific context, weakening the old aristocracy, strengthening the emperor, integrating the elite.
And it fit perfectly with Confucian culture, creating that distinctive civilian official politics where scholars held sway.
Right. Wenguan Zhengzi. And it didn't appear overnight. It evolved over centuries, building on earlier imperfect systems. Other civilizations just hadn't followed that same historical path, didn't face the exact same set of problems, and therefore didn't arrive at this particular institutional solution at that time.
It's fascinating, though, that centuries later, when Western countries were developing their own modern civil service systems in the 18th and 19th centuries, they actually looked to the Chinese model, which they'd learned about from missionaries, as an inspiration for merit-based selection.
It really shows how ideas can travel and be adapted, doesn't it? Different historical paths, but the core concept of selecting officials based on demonstrated ability eventually had global resonance.
And it really underscores how figures like the poet Li Bai are so exceptional because they didn't quite fit the dominant exam pathway. His fame came through other means, patronage, raw genius perhaps, making his career an exception that just proves the rule of how central the exams were for almost anyone else with ambition.
Well said. His unique background allowed him to bypass the standard route, which just highlights how standard that route was.
It really makes you think about how profoundly our own societal structures, our values, even our technologies, shape the paths available to us for success and influence today. How do the systems we live in now, with their own mixes of formal tests, networking, inherited advantages, personal branding, how do they open some doors and close others?
That's a very relevant question to carry away from this.
Absolutely. So we've taken quite a journey today, deep into the world of the Tang Dynasty Imperial examinations. We started with that fierce, burning ambition, fueled by those very real rewards of becoming an official, escaping forced labor, bringing honor to the family.
Then we navigated the complex choices candidates faced, the high-stakes gamble of the literary Jinshi versus the perhaps more predictable MingQing path, each demanding different skills.
We dove into that absolutely crucial, fascinating world of Hangwan, the marketing, the reputation building, the sometimes outrageous stunts, and how Tang Chuanqi became this perfect literary tool for self-promotion within that unique system.
We stepped inside the intense atmosphere of the exam hall itself, understanding those unforgiving rules about taboo characters and rigid stylistic formats, and the attempts to ensure some fairness by locking the examiners away.
And finally, we looked at the outcomes, the immense prestige and celebrations for the winners, the alternative paths for the many who failed, and the system's lasting legacy in forging that deep link between literature and political power in China.
And we put it all in perspective by contrasting the Tang system with the very different situation in contemporary medieval Europe, highlighting the unique blend of social, political, cultural, and technical factors that allowed this remarkable institution to emerge when and where it did.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on as we wrap up. Think about this whole Tang Imperial examination system, this intricate mix of intense personal drive, high-stakes formal testing, strategic networking and self-promotion, the undeniable influence of connections, and that profound belief in the link between academic knowledge, especially literary skill, and the right to govern. How much that historical system, that specific blend of elements, still echoes, maybe in surprising ways, in how we approach education, career advancement, and societal status in our own world today, even across different cultures.
Yeah, what parts feel utterly alien, like they belong to a distant past? And what parts maybe uncomfortably feel kind of familiar?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Well, this has been fascinating, and if you're still interested in the glorious Tang Dynasty, you can take a look at my 4-hour video about the Tang Dynasty.
We genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this. Jump into the comments section and let us know what resonated. Which type of wealth are you focusing on?
Yeah, let us know.
And hey, if you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.